All right. So hi, everyone. Welcome to another week in the Conservation Sciences Seminar. Today we have Dr. Melissa Youngquist, who's from the Shed Aquarium. She's a member of the freshwater research team in the Shed Aquarium's Daniel P. Harthur Center for Conservation Research. Her work at Shed focuses on the effects of invasive species removal and wetland restoration on wetland communities. This work helps inform and improve restoration efforts throughout the Chicago area. Before coming to the Shed, she was a postdoctoral researcher at the U of M. In collaboration with the U.S. Forest Service, she studied how an invasive beetle, the emerald ash borer, might affect amphibians in black ash wetlands. She completed her PhD at Miami University, Ohio, where she studied the effects of habitat and agricultural landscapes on amphibian populations. And she also holds a Bachelor of Science degree in biology from Pacific Lutheran University. And so with that, I'll pass it over to you and I'll have you take over.
Great. Thanks so much, Olivia. And thanks for inviting me to give this talk. So I feel like a lot of negative news often with conservation, and so I'm hoping that through my talk today we'll get to see some hopeful news. And part of that comes with this photo here. These are two toads that were born in the same year, a few months apart. The large one obviously is earlier, and the small one metamorphosed within like 2 weeks of the pond drying. And so just this adaptability is going to be a theme that runs through my talk today, and I hope that you keep this image in mind as we think about it. So when people talk about amphibian conservation, often the first thing that comes to mind is the doom and gloom of the global amphibian declines. There have been a lot of papers on this. This map is showing sort of the number of described amphibian species in each of these regions, as well as the critically endangered and extinct species, and the number that are endangered or vulnerable. And so we do see declines across the globe. Lots of reviews over the last few decades demonstrating this. Things like Status and Trends of Amphibian Declines, Extinctions Worldwide, right? National Geographic picks it up, how all amphibian species are at risk of extinction, and even coming to the idea of the 6th mass extinction event and how it's exemplified by amphibians. I have used these papers in my own research when writing reviews, when writing proposals, to say, hey, let's pay attention to our frogs. When we zoom in and think about the hotspots of species that are threatened, we see these kind of across the globe in different zones. This data is from 2017, so it's a little bit out of date. But what I want to draw your attention to here is the Midwest, where we are. And so there should be 1 or 2 species that are now listed vulnerable by the IUCN. But there's not a lot. And we do have species that are threatened, things like the Illinois chorus frog, the hellbender, grotto salamander, crawfish frogs, which are suffering regional declines and are listed as sort of species of concern or endangered in different states across the region. And then we have a number of species that are declining at the edges of their range. There's not a lot of information known about them. They may be locally abundant and regionally threatened, or regionally abundant but locally threatened. Things like cricket frogs and mud puppies, pickerel frogs, and hood frogs. But what it comes down to is that we've had declines, but we've not yet suffered any extinctions. And so this gives me hope, and I hope it gives all of you hope, that this means that many of our species are resilient to the changes that are still ongoing, and that we still have time to protect our amphibians. So today I'm going to present 2 case studies that I think demonstrate the resilience of our Midwestern amphibians. This is work that I've done for the past 8 years or so. So my first story is going to come from my postdoc, which I did do at U of M and the Forest Service up in the North Woods. And here we wanted to ask, within these black ash wetlands, are these communities unique? And how might amphibians respond to loss of ash caused by the invasive emerald ash borer? And then my second story comes from work that I've just started in Chicago, looking at urban wetlands, and again, asking similar questions. So which species are occupying these habitats, and how do they respond to restoration? And as I go through both these case studies, I'm using very much a similar framework. So the idea is that invasive species are going to change the dominant plant community, whether that's an insect like emerald ash borer removing a native species, or things like buckthorn and Phragmites, which are becoming dominant plant. And through changes in the dominant plant, we get changes in the whole ecosystem and the structure of our landscapes. Right? We're changing the physical structure, we're changing the nutrient cycles, and we're changing the resources that are available for the animals living in these habitats. And ultimately, all this feeds into changes in the native plant animal community, which all feeds back into each other, creating a novel environment. So my work focuses mainly on amphibians and invertebrates, although I've had partners in these systems who are also looking at birds, mammals, and plants. So we're going to start in Minnesota with emerald ash borer. I hope many of you are familiar with this system. So a brief background is that in 2002, this invasive insect was discovered in Michigan, and it's thought to have been introduced in the 90s. This current map with all this blue shaded area is from 2023, and it's the current distribution of emerald ash borer. So, in the past 30 years, it's really spread all across eastern United States. And in 2015, when I started my postdoc, it had just entered the Northwoods. It's a lot more prevalent now than it was 7 years ago or 8 years ago. It lays eggs in the bark. The larvae are wood boring. They sort of bore through the sapwood. It starves the tree, and ash trees die within about 5 years. And so thinking about black ash, these are really unique systems. Black ash grows in hydric soils. And so across sort of northern Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan, it is the dominant tree in forested wetlands. If you have a deciduous wetland, it's going to be a black ash wetland. So any type of water, you're going to have black ash forests. And what happens when you lose your ash is that you get this regression into sort of these open canopy, emergent sedge meadows or shrub wetlands. The question is, how does this change our vertebrate community? So to answer this question, I joined a project that was started in 2012, and it began with an experimental design. That's these triangles right here. I can have a little pointer. So this spot here, the Forest Service and researchers at University of Minnesota did an experiment where they had control plots where ash was retained, clear-cut plots where they removed all the ash, girdled where they killed the ash trees mimicking emerald ash borer, and group selection where they removed just a few pockets of black ash, and they planted other replacement trees. So trying to figure out sort of how these different silviculture treatments affect the hydrology and the native plant community of these sites, as well as whether there are different canopy trees that could eventually replace ash, with the ultimate goal being to retain forested habitat if you can't have a black ash forest. So I was brought on to do the amphibian work. And then we had partners who were also looking at mammals and birds. And I will say that I am going to present results focusing on these reference sites. And these reference sites were surveyed in 2017 and 2018 to try and get a baseline of ideas from across the range of different types of black ash wetlands, they're riverine or flat or depressional pools, what the community is. And the reason I'm not presenting on these experimental sites is because these sites were chosen without amphibians in mind. And so there weren't really good breeding habitat at these sites. And so I wasn't able to look at breeding congregations or larval communities. To get around that, I also paired these reference sites with emergent wetlands to try and get an idea of what is a black ash community versus a non-black ash community. I won't talk too much about the birds and the mammals here, except to say that as you transition from a black ash forest to an emergent wetland, we see these communities change from sort of forested species to meadow species. And when we look at black ash wetlands compared to upland forest habitats, black ash are serving as biodiversity hotspots for our birds. So they're really important for the whole invertebrate community. So who uses black ash wetlands when it comes to amphibians? We found 5 different species. This is an ordination plot. And so points that are close together, these are our sites. And so these sites all had a more similar community. Sites that are far apart from each other in this space had very different communities. Similarly, species that are closer together were more likely to be found together, and species that are far apart were less likely to be found together. So what we saw is that we sort of had our pseudocris ponds, where we had a lot of spring peepers and chorus frogs. We had wood frog and blue-spotted salamander sites, and then sites that occasionally had tree frogs. Woody wetlands within 500-meter buffer of each site was a predictor of community, but for individual species, we found that tree frogs tended to not want a lot of woody wetland around their site, and wood frogs wanted more woody wetland around their sites. And so then we asked the question of sort of how can we predict the diversity of these sites, looking at species richness. And we found the best predictor of richness is the type of wetland that it was. So these are all pond breeding amphibians that breed in ponds that dry every year, vernal pools. And so unsurprisingly, they were not frequently found in our riverine black ash wetlands, and were most likely found or more abundant and higher richness in depressional sites. And what this comes down to is a function of water, where depressional pools tended to have a longer hydro period. This allows our spring breeding amphibians to have enough time to reach metamorphosis. And if you're wetter longer through the year, then you can get your summer breeding amphibians to come, like our tree frogs who don't start breeding until June. And so the next question is, now that we know who uses black ash, how might this community change if we lose all the black ash and black ash wetlands become sort of these emergent open canopy sedgy wetlands? So again, we have another ordination plot where sites close together are more similar in community structure than sites farther apart. Stand height is just sort of the height of the canopy. And so these squares are black ash. They had a higher canopy than our emergent sedgy wetlands. And what we see, so this is again, just amphibians, so just the anurans. We were doing call surveys, so we weren't looking for salamanders at all these sites. So what we see again is that in our black ash sites, we really only had wood frogs, chorus frogs, and spring peepers with an occasional tree frog. But when we move into the emergent sites, we have all these species plus tree frogs, toads, leopard frogs, and occasionally a green frog and a mink frog, some of the much larger permanent emergent wetlands. And so all of our amphibian species are indicator species for an emergent wetland, and only a subset, are actually found using black ash wetlands for breeding. So trying to bring this together, what does this mean? What does this mean for management? Well, we know that our black ash sites have unique amphibian communities, even if they are a subset of the whole regional community of amphibians, but they are very important in terms of bird diversity, and mammals, and plants. When we think about how do we prioritize sites to manage, to either kill off emerald ash borer, inoculate trees, or try to switch from black ash trees to another type of canopy, we really should focus on these depressional wetlands, because that's going to maximize the amphibian diversity. And finally, the take-home message, and perhaps the good news, is that emerald ash borer might not be a hugely negative force on the breeding populations of amphibians in northern Minnesota, where as long as these species have a forest matrix to use during the non-breeding time, that the succession from black ash to emergent may actually benefit some of the amphibians in the landscape. All right, so now we're going to leave the forest and move into the city of Chicago. And so here, looking at amphibian communities in Chicagoland, very similar questions. We're wondering sort of which species occupy our urban wetlands and how are they responding to restoration. So in Minnesota, we're figuring out what happens if an invasive species comes in and changes the landscape. And here we're wondering if we remove an invasive species, how does that benefit the local species, the natives? These are two maps of Cook County. Shedd Aquarium is right here on the edge. And what I want you to take away from this is that Cook County is an urban concrete jungle with a few remaining pockets of green space. Some are quite large and some are very small. And if you had asked me when I first moved to Chicago which amphibians live here, I would have told you bullfrogs and that's it, because they'll survive in the rivers. When in fact, we have at least 12 and maybe as many as 15 different amphibian species that persist in Cook County within these forest preserves. And some of these live sort of right in the downtown area. And so as we think about all these different species and this landscape they're confronted with, I wonder, like, what are the challenges that our amphibians facing in this urban landscape? And so the main one, of course, is the built environment. And we zoom in and think about the actual wetlands, that comes down to a loss of habitat and the degradation of habitat. And so historically, a lot of wetlands have been filled, are continuing to be filled. Sort of all of Cook County was essentially one large wetland. Chicago was a wetland. And so a lot of wetlands have been filled, not only for sort of urban use, but also for agricultural use. This photo is from the 1930s, where one of my current sites is, where drainage tile was added to drain the land and turn it into agriculture. For sites that have been drained, they've had altered hydrologies. So some of them have been made permanent. And this allows fish to invade, and fish and amphibians generally don't get along. Or we have drain tile remaining in some places, which creates hydro periods that are too short. And that leads to failed recruitment and ecological sinks. And compounding this changed hydrology, we have lots of invasive plants. So things like European and glossy buckthorn, reed canary grass, and Phragmites tend to choke out these habitats and make them of poor quality for many amphibians. Fortunately, this is acknowledged, and the value of these temporary wetlands is acknowledged by different agencies. And so the forest preserves at Cook County and Chicago Park District and Shedd Aquarium are all working different areas and together to restore these temporary wetlands and enhance the value of their parklands. So this is, again, a map of the area, and I'm going to highlight sort of a few of the landscapes that I'm working in. So I have one site up north. This is one of the oldest forest preserves in Cook County. And over the last 15 years or so, there's been a big push to restore prairie land, including some of these emergent wetlands. When I joined Shedd Aquarium in 2019, I inherited some sites in the west suburbs. This is where Shedd Aquarium was working really hard to remove invasive buckthorn. And so I've got some experimental sites here looking at how much buckthorn do we remove before we see an effect on our wetland community. Down south, excuse me, this is where that picture was with agricultural land. In the last 15 years, it's since been restored back to a wet prairie. And then in the industrial area of southern Chicago, there are some heavy marshes that are being preserved and restored, as well as some swale habitat that used to be sort of an ash wetland, but is now a more emergent and shrubland wetland habitats. And so I first want to focus a little bit on the site that I inherited in 2019 and started surveying in 2020, where Shedd Aquarium is working to remove buckthorn. And we have some different experimental treatments. So we have control sites where these small ponds and buckthorn remains in the landscape. Basically, all these shrubs, all this greenery is all invasive buckthorn. We have some sites where we've cleared a small perimeter, either 10 or 15 meters from the edge of a pond. And here you can start to see your trees in the forest. Then we have some positive controls in a nearby Illinois nature preserve. This is the highest quality habitat, and you can actually see the forest now. And so I started monitoring the change to the environment to see, is removing buckthorn having an effect? This is a figure of canopy cover, so percent closed canopy. Our negative controls is our buckthorn sites, and we see a very dense canopy. Then we have 10 meters cut, 15-meter cut, and our positive control, this is Illinois Nature Preserve, and we see an opening of the canopy as we remove buckthorn, even more so than the nature preserve has. These in-progress sites are sites that the forest preserves are currently removing buckthorn from, and so there's huge variability because they're kind of half cleared, kind of show that progression from cleared to not cleared. And then I also looked at the ground cover to see how that recovers as we remove the canopy. So we have graminoid, forb cover, and percent woody plants. Again, our negative control is our buckthorn sites, 10 meters cut, 15 meters cut. Our positive control is Illinois Nature Preserve, and then sites that are in the progress of being restored, of having buckthorn removed. And the takeaway here is that 15 meters, we start to see ground cover that looks very similar to our Illinois Nature Preserve. And so this tells me that 15 meters of removed buckthorn is enough to have a rejuvenation of our plants. However, in the first 2 years of after clearing our buckthorn, we've not yet seen a response of amphibians or invertebrates to these experimental treatments. And I think part of this is that 2 years just isn't enough time. And part of this is due to the weather we've had. And I'm going to come back to that in just a moment. But even if we haven't seen a response, there's still hope at these sites, because even in these small ephemeral wetlands that are choked out by buckthorn, that have only had buckthorn removed for a couple of years, we're still seeing chorus frogs and toads across this landscape. And so some people might think, oh, chorus frogs and toads, those are so common, why do we care? But my thought is, wow, even these species can persist in this landscape in these degraded habitats, right? And so these really are our superheroes in our urban landscape. If we go and look at our restored prairies, and so I have 3 restored prairies across Cook County. Most of these, again, are temporary wetlands. Now we start to see leopard frogs joining the community. And so about 10 years after restoration, we see these fellas are migrating across the landscape and are able to recolonize these newly restored sites. And then as we move into our forested nature preserves, so these are sort of large nature preserves. They have been actively managed for at least 10 or 20 years. We start to see a larger forest community. So we're getting our salamanders in, like tiger salamanders, newts, blue-spotted salamanders, as well as tree frogs. And so to me, this shows that restoration is working. It takes time, and we need to provide our amphibians the right habitat. And we're trying to predict sort of the diversity of these sites, looking at sort of the whole landscape within the preserve and outside the preserve. We're surprised to find that the best predictor of diversity in terms of species richness is the diversity within a preserve. And so this hydrological diversity is asking, are there permanent and temporary ponds on site, or is it only temporary? So no diversity means we have only temporary ponds, and yes, diversity means we have temporary and permanent ponds. And so within a whole preserve, we see that if there are permanent ponds on the site, then we have much higher, nearly twice the number of species that preserve is hosting. And it's not just because we're adding things like bullfrogs and green frogs that need permanent habitat. We also see this at the individual level of a single temporary wetland. And so if the preserve has a permanent pond on site, then even temporary wetlands are going to have slightly higher richness than a temporary wetland in a preserve that does not have a permanent pond. And what I think this comes down to is climate resiliency. And so here we're back at an example of these experimental sites in the west suburbs. All these circles are ponds that I've surveyed. This light blue, these are all temporary ponds. This yellow are permanent ponds. And this green is a semi-permanent pond, where if there's a couple years of heavy rainfall, it'll stay wet all year. But if we have low rainfall, then it will dry up. And in this landscape with only temporary sites, we only see our chorus frogs and our toads. And in this Illinois Nature Preserve that also has a couple permanent ponds, we see much higher diversity, including our tiger salamanders and a bullfrog. And I think is that these permanent sites are creating resiliency, because in 2021, we had a drought where our temporary ponds either did not fill up or they dried very early and had completely failed recruitment of amphibians. However, our permanent sites stayed wet and served as a breeding refuge for all the species in our preserve. And so all our species were able to breed and have successful recruitment, even in a drought year. And this drought year was kind of fortuitous because it allowed me to create or make new observations and ask new questions. And one of those is the adaptive phenology of chorus frogs and toads. And so in this figure, we're looking at breeding behavior. So we have time on the x-axis, all right, March, April, May, June, July. The top figure looks at percent sites, and the bottom graph is looking at precipitation. So a little bit of rainfall in March, high rainfall sort of in April and May, and then less rainfall in the summer. Chorus frog breeding activities is percentage of sites that have chorus frogs calling. So chorus frog calling kind of peaks in late March, early April, tapers off, and then we get a May rain, we get another bout of chorus frog calling. And our toads very much follow this rainfall pattern where they call sort of in May with big rain. This line here is the percentage of sites that are ponded. And so in a normal year, our sites stay wet all through the spring and then begin drying in June and in July, with a few sites, again, are permanent within the landscape. So this is a normal year, what we'd expect to see year after year after year. In 2021, we saw a very different pattern. And again, I only saw this because I left my audio loggers up much later than normally I would. And so again, here we have our ponded sites where we start to see ponds drying as early as April. Half of them are dry by May. A little bit of rain fills them up just barely. And a couple weeks later, all ponds are dry except for the permanent sites. And so we see in April, some frogs are trying to call, but not at high abundance. In May, we get a couple of toads calling. Again, these are just the permanent sites. And then in late June, we had a huge rainfall, the largest rainfall of the entire year. It refilled all the sites, and our chorus frogs came back and had a second round of breeding, laying a second clutch. And our toads, many of which delayed breeding, came back and had another bout of breeding with successful recruitment. And tree frogs showed the same pattern as the toads. They had a little bit of calling at the permanent sites in May, and then came back and had another big round of breeding in July after the ponds are refilled. So trying to bring all this together, how can we keep common species common? And what can we tell land managers the simplest, easiest things to do to maintain and keep and recruit species, have the highest diversity possible, given our different respective landscapes? And so the first good news is that restoration does work. Is that many amphibians, if they're given the right habitat types, are resilient, they can persist in different landscapes, they can recolonize newly created habitats, and their populations can rebound. Perhaps unsurprisingly, water is the most important factor for the persistence of our populations. And so what this means is that when we're looking at pond breeding amphibians, we should prioritize depressional wetlands for conservation, especially those that are deep enough to hold water long enough to support some summer breeding species. When we're sort of restoring an entire landscape, we need to ensure that we have interconnected wetlands that have diverse hydrology, because by having both permanent and temporary wetlands, we can support a wider range of species, as well as create a resilient landscape that will safeguard against future climate change. And the fun news, and that I find hope, is that some species may be able to adapt their breeding phenology to this climate weirding. And for those that can't, we do need to have these resilient landscapes. And so there are many, many people that have been involved in these projects. I have to shout out to Brian Palick and Anthony D'Amato and Alexis Grindy for help with the work in Minnesota, and partners with forest preserves and Chicago parks for the work that I am doing here in Chicago. And with that, I believe I have time for some questions.
All right. Sorry, it took me a second to get my camera back on. So yeah, if anyone, same drill, feel free, unmute yourself, or you can put questions in the chat. Looks like you've got a couple in there. Are you able to see that?
Yeah.
Okay. So you can go ahead and read them off, and then you can go and answer.
Will do. So Colleen said, in Chicago in 2021, when there was late breeding time with the late rain, did the eggs develop into adults in time for winter? Yes. So the chorus frogs and the toads did have successful recruitment, and the tree frogs. And so all the species that bred in July were able to metamorphose. And then the next question is, do you think physiological mismatch will pose significant threat to frog populations as global warming continues? That's the big question. So far, the evidence suggests not. I think some species are very adaptable in terms of when, and I think the species that aren't need to have those permanent refuge sites. The biggest issue is going to be when rain falls for these species. So if you have lots of rain early in the year and then no rain all summer and all your ponds dry too fast, then you're going to have failed recruitment. And so it's finding a resilient landscape that can be sort of flexible, species that can adjust to sort of the climate weirding and changes in rainfall pattern that we expect.
Looks like Todd has his hand up.
Yeah, I'll go ahead. You hinted at incompatibility between fish and amphibians in the same water body. And I'm wondering, do you think that's from predation of fish on amphibians, or is it competition for the same food sources, or both maybe?
The largest part is predation, with fish eating the tadpoles of many amphibian larvae. So the exceptions would be like bullfrogs and green frogs. Their tadpoles have a skin secretion that makes them not taste good, and toads as well. But most amphibians that I study that are using temporary ponds do that because there's no fish predators, and so they can take advantage of that environment.
Looks like Madeline, yeah, had one in the chat.
All right. Did you find any sites that were more suitable for more selective salamander species than for more selective frog species? Yes, in the sense that things like spotted salamanders and blue spotteds really require high quality forest landscapes. And so those were only found, as you expect, in the oldest preserves where their quality had been restored and maintained for a long time. And then leopard frogs were most commonly found in landscapes that had prairie habitat either adjacent to or within the prairie itself, because they require that grassland for their terrestrial stage. So Carol says, I like your superhero status for American toads and chorus frogs. Which would be the least resilient of your frogs you documented? Of the ones I've seen, I would say leopard frogs, because I did not see a repeat breeding by them, even in the drought year.
All right, anyone have any other questions? Again, feel free to raise your hand, unmute, or throw it in the chat. We'll give it a couple more seconds. Otherwise, thank you so much for being able to come and give a talk, take some time out of your day. Looks like we don't have anyone. Oh, we got one more. Here we go.
Yes, do you have any idea of the frequency and distance of recolonizers? No, I don't have that exact data. I'll say that salamanders are generally thought to be less able to travel far than frogs, and that many of the frogs in this landscape are considered colonizing species, especially chorus frogs and toads. Toads may be able to travel like tens of kilometers, especially if they have like a river to go down, like some of that. My goodness, I'm losing my words. The riverside habitat. So no, everybody underestimates how far frogs can travel. I would say that. Should timing of traditional frog surveys be reconsidered? Yes. I normally take down my auto recorders for my temporary ponds in mid-June because I figure nobody's calling after that. And ever since 2021, when I didn't take them down until July, I've discovered that I need to leave them up through July, just in case we get these second round breeding events that we want to capture.
All right. So with that, I think that looks like all the questions. So we'll get done a little earlier today. But again, thank you so much for coming and giving a talk for all of us. We really appreciate it here. And yeah, with that, everyone's all good to go. So thanks again.
Thanks so much.
Thanks. Have a good rest of your day.
Yeah, you too.
All right. Bye.